Hello everyone and welcome to another MHA Schools masterclass, this one on dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic event. It's Pedro here, Mental Health Academy CEO and your host for today. This is our last session of the series. It's been a very, very interesting series. And joining me for this session is Rachel Tomlinson. Rachel, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. It's nice to be in touch again. It's been a little while since we've done one of these virtual things together.
I'm back. I can't stay away.
It's good to have you back. It's good to have you back. Before we start the presentation, let me take a moment to introduce you to Rachel in case you haven't come across her work. Rachel Tomlinson is a registered psychologist with nearly 2 decades experience working with children and families. She has worked in children's residential settings, family group homes, women's refuges, play therapy, parenting support programs, education settings, and torture and trauma counseling. Rachel is the author of 2 internationally published books, a non-fiction book called Teaching Kids to Be Kind, which supports parents and professionals to build empathy and compassion in children, and A Blue Kind of Day, a picture book for children about depression. She's a sought-after expert in the media and has featured on television, podcasts, radio, as well as print media, and is a regular writer for many parenting websites. Rachel, anything else you'd like to add about yourself?
I'm a mum as well. I think that always brings a certain level of context to things. But no, thank you for the lovely welcome.
No problem. So let's quickly go through our housekeeping items before we start the presentation. So as a participant joining us live now, you'll notice that you cannot talk during the webinar, but you can use the chat function or the Q&A tabs to interact with your peers during the session or our team and ask questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end, where we're going to ask as many questions as possible about this presentation and more. The session is also being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available via the event portal shortly after the conclusion of the live webinar, along with presentation slides and a handout. And if you're watching this on demand right now, then those things are already available. You have access to them. And to access a certificate, keep an eye on the portal as well. There'll be a button called certificate. And if you click on it, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey for the session. After completion, you'll be able to download the CE certificate, CPD, PD, depends on where you are and what you call it. Now, Rachel, I think that's enough of talking for me. I'm going to launch your slides now, but I'm looking forward to coming back here for our Q&A segment.
Thank you so much. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a very important topic, dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic event. I can see something strange has happened with some of my text being cut off, but you get the gist of things. So before we do jump in, obviously Pedro has already welcomed me, but also just wanting to do an acknowledgement of country. So I am coming to you from Whadjuk land, and I just wanted to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the ongoing connection of our First Nations people on the land and seas on which we reside, and also acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which you are all coming to for today. So before we jump into the meat and bones, I really like to run a practical presentation where there's lots of takeaway things. It's not just knowledge. Before we jump into that, it's really important that we do first unpack some key terms. So what we're going to be looking at and covering today is understanding trauma. How does trauma manifest in students? Trauma and the brain. What is your role as educators? How to be a trauma-informed school. Setting up your classroom with strategies to support emotional regulation, de-escalation, knowing when to refer, and then all importantly, looking after yourself. So as we go, please do pop anything in the chat box, but I'm also aware that people will be watching later, so there'll be a bunch of self-reflective questions and points to consider for your ongoing growth and learning. So understanding trauma. So I think we sort of bandy around the term a bit much, but let's go with a formal kind of definition of trauma. So trauma is a psychological and physiological response to an event or a series of events that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. It disrupts their sense of safety and it triggers significant changes in their nervous system. So it's not just simply something is not nice or horrible. We do sometimes say that was so traumatic when something has been very upsetting. But in the clinical sense of things, it's actually a perceived threat to person's safety. So the person must feel that their life, body, or emotional integrity is somehow in danger. It also comes with a loss of control or feeling of helplessness, really compounds that trauma. So the event that happens to the person occurs with little or no ability to stop it or be able to escape from it. And this creates a sense of overwhelm to their nervous system. And so we're talking about experiences that are very extreme or are prolonged in terms of triggering that nervous system process. It can also come with a violation or expectation of trust. So it could be harm occurring from somebody that would be expected to typically care for them. So it could be, a parent, a guardian, a teacher, a partner if we're talking about some of our older students. And what also compounds that trauma is lack of support during or after an event. So a lack of comfort, difficulty returning to a sense of safety, lack of validation can turn what is a distressing event into a traumatic one. And it can have a lasting impact on our functioning. So we can see persistent emotional, cognitive, physiological symptoms. So we'll get into some of these shortly. And then we also have different kinds of trauma. So you've got acute, chronic, and complex. So if anyone wants to have a little moment to guess to themselves what they think each of those might be. But an acute is a one-time, very serious or significant event. Chronic is repeated or ongoing stresses. And then we can also break down when we're sort of looking at trauma, if you fully pathologize trauma, it can become post-traumatic stress disorder. We also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we're talking about PTSD or trauma, which is just the event itself, not all trauma leads to PTSD, just to be clear. We can also have complex trauma or complex PTSD, and these are typically events or occurrences. They can be single, but they're more likely to be prolonged. They're more likely to occur within the context of interpersonal relationships, because that really breaks that internal sense of safety or potentially early attachments. And it more often than not occurs during childhood. So things that you might see in school settings could be accidents, bereavement, including grief and loss. It could be of a student or a teacher, or it could be outside, so family member or friends, family and domestic violence. It could be community trauma, so something that's happened outside in the community, a significant event, or even an incident at school. So I'd like to invite a small reflection here. So when a student reacts strongly, what is the story that you tell yourself about their behaviour? If anybody does feel like sharing, perfect, but also jotting this down. If you're watching at home, you can press pause and jot this down, because it's really good to get a pre-understanding of how you might be using your own lens to interpret student behaviour. So you might see a number of really, challenging or interesting behaviours. But what we really want to pick apart today, and by the end of this session get to the understanding, is instead of thinking what's wrong with you, we want to come at students' presentation and challenges and cultivate a mindset of curiosity and compassion. So changing what's wrong with you to shifting that to what's happened to you, and understanding that lived experience is likely to impact the behaviours that are probably pretty challenging for you in the classroom. So let's take a little look at this trauma iceberg. Oh, I can see some comments in there. Stop, allow them some time before trying to help. I love that. Yes, please keep contributing if you like in the chat box. I love to hear all of this as we're talking. So in this trauma iceberg, what we're looking at, what people see is above the surface. So these are all the behaviours that we're likely to see as quite challenging. And this is very much the mindset of what is wrong with you. And this is when we see behaviours like students being oppositional, they can't focus, they're disengaged, they're challenging, they're defiant, there's rage, maybe we see overcompliance. This is all above the iceberg. This is what you see. But then underneath that, what's actually driving these behaviors that you see, and as with icebergs, there's often a lot more underneath the surface than we take for granted. So what might be driving some of these things could be panic attacks, flashbacks to the event, having low self-esteem, being untrusting, feelings of worthlessness, suicidal ideation or intent, feeling really scared, anxious, difficulty sleeping, feeling helpless. So, for example, if you have somebody who is feeling like they've got a lack of control because of their sense of safety was completely upended, you might see that as overly controlling or defiant because they're trying to control what they can in their world. And so you might see the outward expression of that. And believe me, it's very challenging and you would know. But we actually need to see what's underneath and what's driving it. And exactly like the comment that I can see in there, we might see kids or describe them as being naughty, defiant, rather than actually looking at what is happening underneath. So how does trauma manifest in students? And I'm saying students, so this is how trauma manifests in humans, but this is what you might observe in school or observe in the classroom. So trauma can show up differently for everybody. It really depends on the individual and the environment. So it will depend on their level of resilience, what coping strategies they've had, what supports they've got within their family and within their extended networks, but also their unique response. Everybody has a different way of coming at the world based on their experiences. Are they generally trusting? Are they outgoing? Do they communicate their feelings easily? All of these kinds of things will depend on whether somebody internalizes or externalizes their trauma, how they respond to it and cope. So what we sort of see with trauma is that you can see a trigger to the nervous system, that fight, flight, and freeze, essentially. And some people, and it could also be dependent on the type of threat or, the situation itself, that will lead to either hyperarousal, which is fight and flight. So their system is hyper or overly aroused, or you've got hypoarousal, which is freezing, collapsing. These are survival states. These are not intentional. This is what your body does in that moment of danger or risk in order to keep you safe. And there is no control over how your system is going to react. The type of situation might differ, as in which one pops up. Does your brain very immediately decide that it could keep you safe by running from danger? Or is it going to say, if I freeze and play dead, am I likely to be able to escape this danger? So your brain is making these split-second, entirely subconscious decisions. And so then that might kick off down the track or sort of tell us what latter behaviours might look like if somebody became hyper or hypo-aroused based on this traumatic situation. So we have 4 different domains where we might see trauma manifesting in different behaviours. So emotional, you might see anxiety, numbness, irritability. Now, an anxious or, sorry everybody, you may have heard that I am slightly sick today. An anxious or irritable student isn't being dramatic. And again, that's the stuff that we might see sort of above the iceberg. their system is generally overwhelmed. Then we look at the behavioral domain. You might see withdrawal, aggression, risk-taking. They're often it often signals that they have unmet safety needs when you see either withdrawal or aggression. With cognitive, we might see difficulty concentrating, memory issues. Now, these things are impacted when we're in survival mode. So when our brain is in survival mode and we have experienced a sense of danger, our brain then sort of gets primed to look out for danger. So this is why if things don't resolve quickly after a traumatic event, we're likely to see it either become, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or, we might see some of these outwardly manifesting behaviors, because if they don't return to that sense of safety, their brain remains on the lookout for danger. So our brain is, despite what people think, we actually cannot multitask. Multitasking is just how quickly your brain can switch between tasks. So when your brain's primary focus is keeping itself safe, it's on the lookout for danger. And so it makes it really hard to concentrate, because, that maths question on the board is really not what your brain is interested in. Its priority is keeping you safe. So it's tracking the classroom. It can make you fidgety. It can make you irritable. It can make it hard to remember things because it's not sinking in, because your brain is managing and assessing for risk all around. So you can see how this these cognitions, might look like challenging behaviors in the classroom, but it's actually driven by those unmet safety needs. And then we see social. So this generally comes from having difficulty trusting people, or that trauma and that sort of safety mechanism of the brain is misreading cues. Your brain is trying to keep you safe, so you might misread someone who's just speaking quite normally. Perhaps they raise their tone and it's misinterpreted as anger or rage. And so this can then in turn lead to things like isolation, so wanting to avoid people, to avoid, danger or threat, or, the shame or stigma of feeling just stressed and overwhelmed by trauma. It can also lead to conflict with peers, particularly if they're having trouble with misreading social cues. So based on some of the behaviours that you would consider challenging in the classroom, and some of them are genuinely just challenging behaviours. Not every challenging behaviour is an underlying trauma, but just have a look and consider for a moment, maybe self-reflect, what's the behaviour that you've seen in the classroom that could actually be a trauma response? Now, trauma and the brain. We have this lovely image of the brain here, and if you're watching live or even watching later, play along at home. So I use the fist as a model of the brain. So you curl your thumb in, curl your fingers around. Now, if I turn to the side, this is sort of the direction. So my forearm is my spinal cord. This is the back of my brain. This comes right through to the front of the brain. Okay, and inside is a part of the brain that houses our emotions, essentially. So I'm being quite simplified with this. And we also talk about, the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. So the closer we get to the back of the brain and the brain stem, the older or more primitive the part of the brain is. So this is the part of the brain that keeps us alive. It's entirely subconscious. It's things like heart beating, breathing, temperature regulation, all of those kinds of things that we have absolutely no control over. Now, as we get from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, and also from the bottom of the brain to the top of the brain, it becomes more sophisticated. And so another part of the brain that's fairly automatic is our limbic system in the middle, which generally controls our emotions. Now, what happens is when we curl our fingers over, I'll explain that this part of the brain here, so it's right at the front of our head, is called our prefrontal cortex. Now, that part of the brain is logic and reasoning. The middle part of our brain is reaction, it is go. The front part of our brain is the stop or the brakes. Now, when we talk about this front part of the brain, what's really interesting is, and it may not be a surprise to anyone who has worked with children, is this part of the brain, it's there in structure, but it puts on its finishing touches. It becomes complete in early adulthood. So for girls, it's generally late teens. For our boys, it can be up to their early 20s before this part of their brain, the logic and reasoning part of their brain, puts on its finishing touches. So what that means is that the key driver of the brain, or the part of the brain that's the most developed during childhood and adolescence, is this mid part of the brain, which is the emotions. Now, when somebody has experienced trauma, basically, I call it popping the top. So what happens as a visual of this is the part of their brain that is driving and in charge is this automatic response. It keeps them safe. We have big, strong emotions being the driver. And their logic and reasoning is no longer there. They can't use that logic and reasoning to sort themselves out, to respond. You're speaking directly to distress, overwhelm, big emotions. You're not talking to the logic and reasoning part of their brain. So this is why we see so much dysregulation with trauma, is the downstairs part of their brain, that kind of like midbrain, is in the driver's seat. And so when we're saying to them, sit down, stop shouting, we're actually talking to a part of the brain that can't process that logic and reasoning. So we're going to talk through some strategies about how we can help them pop the tops back on. And so we can actually start to re-engage this part of the brain that we need to be in the driver's seat for safe classroom behaviours and for appropriate classroom behaviours. So I can see a couple of comments in the text, the chat box. So this was back about the previous slide of behaviours that you've noticed. So refusing staff directions, absolutely. We know that there are many other reasons for some of these behaviours as well. As I said, they're not all trauma, but absolutely it could be if somebody needs to experience a sense of control, then absolutely refusing directions because I'm going to stay in control. I'm going to be in charge of my world. I need to be the one who's saying X, Y, and Z or making these choices because making choices makes me feel safe. So absolutely, you're likely to see things like refusing staff direction. Sleepiness, yes, we see either sleepiness because the system is depressed. If you see hypoarousal, so it's like a flattening, like a lethargy, but then you can have hypoarousal. Sorry, everyone. Which makes it really hard to settle down. And so sleeping is really difficult if you've got things like flashbacks or nightmares, which are very common after a traumatic event. Falling asleep and staying asleep are going to be really difficult because of all the cortisol and adrenaline racing around your body. We're seeing anger, apathy, lack of motivation. Those are all really key things that you might see as a result. And overtly sexual behavior could absolutely be one. We see that as a risky behavior. It could be as an attempt to connect, or it could be to engage in risk to feel something. So there's a number of reasons why we might also see overtly sexual behavior as well, particularly if there is a childhood trauma associated with sexual abuse. You might actually see that as an expression as well. Sorry, everyone. I'm trying to get through this without coughing too much. So essentially, just coming back to the picture of the brain, trauma disrupts the communication between the systems in the brain. So we have this driving seat, this lower or downstairs part of the brain is essentially being triggered and is being highlighted to keep the young person safe. And it makes it hard for them to access this thinking part of the brain. You cannot logic a dysregulated child back into feeling calm. So we're going to talk about, sorry everyone, co-regulation shortly and how do we actually bring them back into that calm. I'd also like you to self-reflect and think about, how does your own stress response show up when a student is dysregulated? So we can all experience a secondary trauma, or we can experience our own sensory sensitivities, or have our own stress response in response to a student's dysregulated or heightened behaviour. And this really highlights one of our later points about our own regulation and being able to understand trauma and the responses so that we can understand and explain the behaviour, but also so that we can support ourselves when the inevitable of being triggered by some of these potentially challenging behaviours. So just consider, how does your own stress show up when a student is being dysregulated? So what is the role of educators? So firstly, I want to be really clear. You are educators. You are not therapists. So you don't need to suddenly develop, go and reskill and have a whole new qualification or anything like that. You are teachers. You are educators. But because of your role, you might often be the first responder to your students after a traumatic event. So what we're going to do is cover and talk about the 3 R's. So in here, I'm going to share some practical strategies. It looks like quite a small slide, but there's a lot of content sort of behind it. So definitely jot down some notes. Think about what resonates with you, what strategies you might like to try. So when we talk about that brain, as we said, we have to pop that top back on so that we can speak to this logical part of the brain. So the first R relates to regulate. So regulate is helping the body and the brain feel safe and calm first. If you don't do that, you'll continue to speak to this mid or lower part of the brain, which is the survival system. You will be speaking to a child who cannot think clearly. They're not processing language. Language kind of sits about here, somewhere here in the brain. It's definitely that higher order or upper part of the brain. So they're not processing language. They're not making clear decisions. That sits here. The goal of regulation is to calm that nervous system enough, just enough to move them out of fight, flight, and freeze mode. So what does regulation involve? It involves often co-regulation. So they might be so regulated that if you said, hey, Jimmy, take some calm breath, they're not processing. They're not processing that language. But what they will be doing, that sort of subconscious part of their brain, will be processing your tone. So you want to keep things calm, soft. So ensure that your voice is very regulated. I call it my psychologist voice, but it would be, hey, Jimmy, okay, I can really see you're feeling overwhelmed. I can see that you're really upset right now. We just slow it down. It feels a little bit awkward and a little bit put on at first, but it's very much slowing things down. So he might not hear the words initially, but he will hear the tone. Make sure you keep a physical and emotional distance that feels safe. If the system feels threatened, then coming in too close or moving too quickly into a student's space can often escalate and really trigger that fight, flight, and freeze. So they might flee further, or they might come at you in fight mode, or they could completely freeze. So we want to make sure that if we are coming into their space, that we are doing it softly, slowly, and that we do keep a level of physical and emotional distance. We can start by doing some slow breathing and co-regulated breathing. Have you ever sort of heard any of those studies or ever seen any of the mimicry kind of studies where if you want someone to like you or connect with you, you kind of copy their body postures or their tone or whatever it might be? We can kind of use that same principle and work alongside it. So just by being close to someone, if we start to talk a little bit slower, take some conscious, we don't have to make them, elaborate, but, slow, calm breaths. What happens is their body will start to sort of co-regulate and match and come alongside you. And so they will become co-regulated simply from you mirroring or, showing them what it is that you want them to replicate. We can also do rhythmic or sensory activities. So it could be, sometimes you see this is why people sort of automatically pace. Their body likes the rhythm of the back and forth and the movement. So sometimes it's the body's automatic way of trying to, rid itself or process a traumatic experience and to regulate that fight, flight, and freeze. So we can get like squeezing a stress ball. Sometimes that's why people tick their pens. They're working on internal regulation. It could be, a rhythm. Could be drumming, rocking, walking. We also then, as part of this regulation, is also be a predictable, steady adult presence. You don't need to fix it. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to fix this traumatic event. All they need to know is, I'm here, you're safe. You can even repeat those words very slowly, adding in some intentional breathing. I'm here, you're safe. It all sounds, when you're not in the moment, it all sounds a little bit awkward. I've had people say that feels really strange or uncomfortable, but you're not talking to this logical part of their brain. You're talking to the part of their brain that needs all of its senses to be regulated. So that's what we're doing here, is we're trying to hijack those senses and regulate them. Because until that body is calmer, their brain literally is not going to be able to access logic or conversation. Regulation is the bridge to connecting the parts of the brain again and popping that top back on. The next R is relate. So building connection once the child is calmer, child or young person, is calmer. Once they have begun to settle, that's when you're going to be able to connect with them. So you're then tapping into their emotional or social brain. This is the part of their brain that will allow them to feel understood and supported. So what does this look like? What does relating look like? It's a warm tone. It's using empathic statements. Again, sometimes as adults, we want to rush to fix the problem when it's not your responsibility, nor could you probably actually fix this traumatic event. They don't need you to fix it. But empathy also doesn't look like pushing down their emotions. So I know that this one sounds quite interesting. We want to say things like, you'll be okay, it's okay. But their body is screaming, actually, no, I'm not okay. It won't be okay. How do I can't prove I'm in this moment. It doesn't look like things will be okay. So instead, what we do is we use empathic statements. I can see that you're so upset. You're so mad right now. I can see that made you so upset. It's okay to feel scared sometimes. Everybody feels frightened sometimes. So what we're doing is we're connecting in with that emotion. We're validating their feelings. That was really tough. I can see why you're so upset. These things are creating that emotional and social connection. As they start to feel understood and supported, it helps to create emotional safety. So we're using that relationship as a driver, to help them move towards feeling emotionally safe. Someone sees me. Someone gets me. Someone understands me. Somebody cares about me. And these all sound, people often say these sound quite fluffy. But if you imagine to yourself, you're having a really horrible day. Let's say, you're running late for work or an important appointment, and you're trying to get out of the door and you're rushing around and you're trying to get the kids' shoes on. You can only find one sock. There's a shoe that's outside. Nobody remembers to do the homework. You pour yourself a coffee and you realize the milk is off. We've all had one of those mornings. You shut the door behind you as you run out and realize you've locked your car keys inside the house. Now, let's say you call up a friend and the friend goes, oh, well, you should be more organized. Every day what the routine is. Why didn't you get the kids to put their shoes back where they belonged last night? criticisms or, the logic of, yeah, of course, things would be easier if I was a bit more organized. We know that, but when you're feeling distressed, you would probably get quite defensive. You'd probably feel quite let down, quite upset. But imagine if that friend said instead, oh my gosh, that sounds like a morning. Oh, I'm so sorry you had such a rough morning. It feels nicer. You immediately feel like a sense of relief or a sense of calm when someone has named your internal experience because they can see you, and it feels better. We feel that sense of relief and go, oh, that's why therapy works. That's why psychology and counseling is so effective. Is you can't underestimate the power of feeling heard and seen by somebody and offering your presence without judgment. That's where those empathic, understanding statements and validation comes really important. So why is it important to relate? Connection reduces shame, it increases trust, and it signals to our brain, you are not alone, you are supported. And a connected child is far more willing to cooperate with you. Connection is key in order to get those appropriate or more pro-social behaviors coming back into the classroom. Now, the final one, reason. This is where we do the problem solving. We can do the problem solving when the top is back on. We cannot do it until all of these other steps have been followed first. So this is when we can do problem solving. This is when you can have your teachable moments. This is also where we can have reflection and reparation. So only once they're regulated can we access this thinking part of the brain. So this is when you discuss what has happened. So you do a bit of a review of, okay, so you got really upset when somebody called you a name, let's say, and then you started swearing and you threw your chair, Then we start to talk about alternative strategies. I can fully understand that you were frustrated and overwhelmed. However, what do you think that we could do next time? When you're feeling angry, is there another thing that we can do? So we start teaching these alternative strategies. We can also set boundaries. So actually that's not something that we can accept in the classroom. These are some more acceptable behaviors, or this is what we can do in the classroom, letting them know what is possible and making plans. This is also the stage where we help them to understand if there are consequences for their actions. They need to be sufficiently regulated before we talk about consequences, because that could be very re-triggering. This is also when we have restorative conversations. So this is some of the biggest learning and some of the biggest impact that I see in the therapy and the mental health space. So restoring or repairing relationships after a rupture is vital, because a lot of the time we forget this stage. But when we can repair it, we can actually teach children, you are worthy. You might have made a mistake, but you don't need to be perfect. I still care about you, and you are still worthy despite making mistakes. And that sense of connection, again, helps to reduce shame, increase trust, and depending on the nature of the traumatic event, that could also go a really long way. Even though you're not a therapist and you're not responsible for that, that can actually go a long way to reducing some of the impact of the traumatic event itself, depending on what it was, particularly if it's related to loss of trust, or it resulted in feelings of shame. So why does reason matter? Trying to reason too early is just ineffective, and it can often escalate behaviors. Once the brain is calm and connected, then and only then will reasoning become meaningful and productive, and they will actually learn from it. So quick recap: regulate is about calming the body, relate is about connecting emotionally, and reason is about teaching, talking, and problem solving. This sequence works because it follows that architecture of the brain from the bottom to the middle to the top. So We also need to understand that safety and connection precede learning. So not only are we talking about addressing challenging behaviors in the classroom, but if you've got a young person walking around with a brain like this, where this dysregulated part of the brain is in the driver's seat, they won't be learning. So not only are you likely to see challenging behaviors, but they're also not going to be an engaged, effective learner. So calm adults create calm classrooms. Children can only learn and participate in classroom activities and social situations when they're effectively regulated. We also have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So many people will be familiar with this. It's essentially, if you're old enough like me and you remember the food pyramid, we have the base of this pyramid, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is the essential stuff, the building blocks. So back in the food pyramid language, that was carbohydrates, so breads, pastas, grains, things like that. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that base is safety. So we're talking about physical and emotional safety, and it can include things like, freedom from, incidents, or, just being in a situation that is unsafe, or it could be unsafe housing or insecure housing or things like that. But essentially, this base is safety. Now, when we are asking students to learn and participate in a classroom, we're asking them to sort of work in this top part of the pyramid, which is, learning, development, self-actualization, which is a very big word for this time of the morning. But without that base, they actually can't access these upper tiers because their primal need will be focused on meeting their safety concerns first. So if you don't have a regulated child who feels safe, there is no way that you can get to these top tiers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of learning, development, self-actualization. So if we bring this into the school setting, what does it mean to be a trauma-informed school? So we've talked a little bit about what you can individually do in the classroom, as an educator. But we'll also bring in, there are 6 key principles from the SAMHSA and Australian guidelines around what are trauma-informed principles. So the first one is safety. So safety in a school setting can look like predictable routines and clear boundaries. So a boundary is the rule. Are the rules clear, and are the consequences clear too? The next one is trustworthiness and transparency. So this is about explaining when changes need to happen, following through, being consistent. If you say you're going to do something, are you? That includes boundaries and consequences. So a clear example is, you see a child having a tantrum at the shops, they're having a meltdown because they want that chocolate bar, and the parents say, no, 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 no. The child continues to tantrum, and eventually the parent gives in and says, fine, have the chocolate bar, because they want the noise to stop. So that child has ultimately learned, well, that was great. If I continue to kick off and I continue to have this tantrum, then I will essentially get what I want. So they don't have clear boundaries of when I say no, it means no. Or actually, we're going to leave because, you can't have a tantrum in the shops like this. So those things actually create a lack of safety. And for students that have been traumatized, if you don't follow through on the things that you have said, or if there's a rule and it's not clear or it's not adhered to consistently, that can actually escalate feelings of lack of safety and can trigger off, particularly if they're still quite sensitive, that fight, flight, and freeze response. So we need to be trustworthy. We need to be transparent. We're doing X because of Y. Being really clear about the whys of things. The next one is peer support. And this involves, can you structure within the classroom or within the school opportunities for students to support one another? I've seen really beautiful buddy benches, where there's a specific bench in the school that's for kids that can go and sit there if they don't have anybody to play with, and others know that, if they see someone there, it's really lovely to go and, welcome them and play with them. But do you also have opportunities in the classroom for them to, to connect and help and support one another? We're not talking about therapeutic support or them supporting them with the trauma, but just that chance for peer connection and to have a really nice, collegial kind of atmosphere with the kids supporting one another and helping. So it could be problem solving or group activities or teamwork that really sort of builds on that peer support. Collaboration. Now, this one is key, and it can be really tricky because, quite often for time saving and as adults, we kind of just say, well, this is what I've said, this is the rules, this is what we're doing, this is the plan, this is the assessment, this is the activity that we're doing today. And that's all well and good, and it definitely saves our time. But collaboration and involving students in decision-making when possible and appropriate is vital. If you give children opportunity to make choices, it could even be simple choices, blue pen, red pen. I know that's simplifying things, but if you give children choices where you can, it means they're less likely to try and exert that control in less pro-social or helpful ways. So if you've got somebody who's experienced a lack of trust, the traumatic event involved them having their sense of autonomy taken away, they might be trying to grab onto that and trying to really, really overtly claw back a sense of control or interpersonal power. And that can turn into unhelpful power dynamics or issues in the classroom where they're trying to be very controlling or taking control away from the educator. So if you give them choices, I'm not going to say it will take it all away, but it will absolutely minimize the opportunity, for them to be having to try and get control in unhelpful ways. This sort of builds into the next one of empowerment and choice. This means offering options, which helps build students' sense of control. It also builds their sense of self-worth. When you invite them in and allow them choice, or you consider their opinions, it really makes them feel fantastic about themselves. And that comes back to the Bruce Perry 3 R's, that relate. They feel valued, they feel seen, they feel like what they have to say is important. And that is really vital in building that sense of self-worth and that sense of positive self-identity. When you have a connected child, you're more likely to have a cooperative child, if we come back to those previous examples. And then we also come down to cultural, historical, and gender awareness. So I think the risk we run is that we, just go out and read lots of information about lots of different cultures or historical events, or, we read things to try and understand other genders' perspectives, or to be, aware of, diverse gender or sexuality preferences and orientation. However, sometimes that really negates or forgets that you've got a unique person in front of you. So while we acknowledge and understand some of these things like different cultures and, different historical perspectives, it's actually really important to, instead of trying to learn all of those things, it is important, but instead of trying to learn all those things, it's more vital to learn about the person in front of you and what does all of their lived experience culminate in to make them a unique individual, and what does safety look like for them, what does trust look like for them, what does choice look like for them, rather than, applying a one-size-fits-all kind of response, even within diverse groupings. So it's about understanding that person and their unique perspectives and seeing how you can use that information to build a trauma plan, or to build, that sense of safety for that unique individual. We also do have to understand the the impact or potential of intergenerational trauma. So you might be working with a young person who hasn't experienced a specific traumatic event themselves. However, we know, particularly in the Australian setting, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals are likely to experience intergenerational trauma, which we do need to understand that perspective and how it may impact them in the classroom and how it may impact them as individuals. We also have the potential to see racial trauma or community-specific experiences. So it's really trying to understand, as I said, what has gone on in that person's cultural, historical, and interpersonal experiences that have led to that trauma, how they're responding to and understanding that trauma, and then what does safety look like for them. So I've done a bit of talking, so probably time for another self-reflection. So which of these principles, and you can answer in the chat or you can self-reflect if you're watching this another time, which of these principles feels the most present in your school? Which one do you see being lived? It's just part of your school's makeup. You know, what is it that your school does very well? And then conversely, what do you see as potentially missing in your school after this event? What do you think you could possibly take away and consider implementing or improving in your school? So some classroom strategies that support regulation. We've already gone through a couple of examples when I was running through the 3 R's, but let's do some specific examples. So we've also gone school-wide. So predictability. So when you're talking about your classroom, you can enhance predictability by sharing routines. So it might already seem like there's enough predictability in it because, I mean, if you're in primary school, you might have, the students stay in the class, but you might have a clear timetable of Monday morning is art, Monday mid-morning is English, etc., etc. And in high school, you might see students moving from classroom to classroom. So you might think that it's fairly predictable that I'm a maths teacher, therefore, that should be predictable. They're coming here for maths. However, you can add additional predictability and routine by helping set up the running of the class or the subject. So it could be writing up on the board, the first 5 minutes of every class is everybody sit down, a quick welcome, a quick recap. The next X number of minutes will be spent, reading or learning. The next will be spent practicing. And then the last will be, reflecting and checking in or setting homework, whatever it might be. It's just having the more sort of open, transparent you can be about what's happening, the better. That may change, between classes, but we're still just trying to emphasize that predictability and routine. So it could be having, a visual display. This is probably more appropriate for the younger groups, but a visual display of what, the day looks like. When do they have X class? When is recess? When is lunch? When is it time to move their bodies, etc.? We can reduce anxiety and guessing by letting the brain know what to expect. So if the brain doesn't have that information, it's off in the background looking for that information to try and help it predict or understand what's coming next. And we want to save all of that brain activity for classroom stuff. We don't want the brain sort of looking around for danger or threat or trying to make sense of what is happening. If we tell them, it just reduces that. Analysis paralysis, we can potentially shut down our students' brain or reduce its effectiveness by just not sharing enough of what to expect. Sounds simple, but it's very effective. We can also talk about sensory regulation. So I think that the days of students sitting in a classroom, back straight, writing in silence and not moving has probably a little bit gone on the wayside. We are starting to recognize that actually movement is really important to help regulate. So when I talk about that, we might be considering, do you plan in movement breaks? So after a chunk of learning, and that will differ depending on the age of the children that you have in your classroom, but also their level of capacity and also the subject. So we probably don't need movement breaks for something like an art class because they're already going to be moving around to get a pencil or moving their bodies or just sort of engaging themselves in, other activities besides, thinking or, arithmetic or reading or writing. So can you build in movement breaks? So after 15 minutes of education, does everyone get up and do some some star jumps? Or do you allow fidget spinners or fidget objects in your room, as long as they're not causing disruption for other students? For younger students, I don't know how this would work with students sort of moving from classroom to classroom, but some students may benefit from bands on the legs of their chair. So you've got the chair, you've got sort of it's like an OT or therapy band. They put their legs in between and they can sort of move their legs and kick them, and the resistance of the band, it's not super disruptive because it's quite a firm band, not cutting off the circulation to their legs or anything like that, but it's quite a firm band. And so it creates, they can sort of move and they can engage that proprioceptive need of moving and pressure work, and that can be really effective. Can you build in a quiet corner where there's a certain, area of the classroom where it's quiet? Maybe there's some noise cancelling headphones, or students can bring their loops or earplugs by negotiation into the classroom, or can you set aside some of the classroom for a quiet space? There could also be calm spaces as well. So sometimes, having certain types of music, or, a stress ball or essential oils, could be some sensory Play-Doh or something like that in a specific place in the classroom. Maybe it's on your desk and the students can calm and help themselves. You would want to set parameters and rules around this, but it can be a really great way of not disrupting the rest of the classroom when you have that opportunity for choice. As we mentioned before, an empowerment of, I feel dysregulated, I feel empowered to go and use this tool to self-regulate. And you would do it by pre-negotiation, and you would sort of preset the boundaries and the rules around usage, and that would be individual to each of you and your classrooms and what type of class it is. But it is really important to consider how you might use some of these tools to engage in sensory regulation. Another strategy is emotional literacy. Now, I said before about, validating and naming emotions is really vital in de-escalating, because what you're doing is when the brain is going like this, and you provide words to that, and you say, oh my gosh, it looks like you're feeling so angry right now. You look so mad. It looks like you're really worried about that. Whatever it might be, you're adding a layer of, you're helping put the top back on, you're connecting, but you're also helping them make sense of that inner experience. A lot of young people really struggle to make sense of their inner experience. So all they're feeling is the intense sensations and discomfort without context. And it sounds so simple, but it's incredibly effective to simply name somebody's emotion to help them understand what's going on. And then when they can better understand it, they're less fearful of the situation. So you're actually less likely to see further escalations if they can understand what's happening for them. But it also, helps them to connect with you. We know that connected students are more cooperative students. They're more likely to engage and more likely to be able to talk to them and engage them. So you can do this by doing check-ins. So it could be everybody can, rate themselves on a traffic light scale. So as you call the roll, you might say, Chad, red, orange, green. And then Chad goes green and you go, okay, Michaela, orange. So it could be just a really quick check in as they're going. You can name feelings as you see them. Simple, but very, very effective. You can model regulation strategies. So you could talk about, sometimes in the classroom when I get stressed, I use my special stress ball and I take a couple of deep breaths. What does everybody else do when they're feeling overwhelmed? Get some ideas, get some engagement. And then you can also co-regulate, being super, super mindful of your facial expressions. So somebody who's traumatized or has experienced trauma may misinterpret your cues. We know that misinterpretation is likely. So making sure that you really sort of relax your facial expressions, keep them as neutral as you can to avoid some misinterpretation. Think about your body language. Instead of standing up over a student and talking to them, can you come down to their level? Can you use open body postures to indicate, openness, willingness, connection? Your breathing patterns, your voice, how slow it is, can you drop your voice down a little bit lower, speak a little bit slower to them? All those kinds of things that, could potentially be in your control. So I'll also share a really quick grounding activity that can be done in the classroom. In fact, I'll probably share two. Because it looks like we have the time. So the first one, actually, I'll go back. Sorry. Grounding is bringing somebody back to this present moment. So what happens for all of us is our brains get tangled up in the future, in the what if or the worries or thinking about things that have happened in the past. And with trauma, there's often flashbacks or rumination or things like that. So sometimes, and so all of those things, will affect how we feel. If we're thinking about worried things, we're probably going to feel a little bit anxious. Makes sense. We're thinking about things that made us feel, scared, frightened, out of control. We'll probably feel quite worried or maybe angry. So it's really important to bring ourselves back to this present moment where there probably is no danger or threat. But our brain kind of forgets it. So we need to bring ourselves back to this neutral moment in time. Now, you may have heard this one before, but it's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it could be at the beginning of the class. You could do it to sort of form part of a natural break, to give the students a bit of a brain break. Or it could be if you notice that there's some dysregulation in the classroom. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is naming 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Now, being in a classroom setting, the last 2 might be ones that you wish to leave off, depending on whether you've got any arranged, you might send around like a sprayed scent card with an essential oil sprayed on it, or maybe you've got some eucalyptus leaves from the garden, or a flower or something that they can intentionally sniff. We probably don't want to be recommending that students are sniffing or tasting things that are maybe not so appropriate. So we could just do the 5, 4, 3, or you could do 3, 2, 1, depending on the age of the children and their capacity. But essentially what you're doing is by getting them to look around and name 5 things you can see and 4 things they can hear, you're inviting them to be present. So can they see a lamp? Can they see a window? Can they see a pencil? Can they see a notebook? What you're doing is bringing them out of those past patterns, those unhelpful thoughts that are making them feel worried, scared, overwhelmed, and you're bringing them back to this neutral moment. This is a pen. This is probably not a trigger. This is probably not concerning for them. It's neutral. And when they think about this neutral thing, they generally don't have any feelings associated with that neutral thing. So it's just a nice, quick grounding activity. Another one is getting students to look out a window. Typically, I would imagine most classrooms have a window. If you don't, you could pre-arrange some pictures. Maybe it's a picture of a rainforest, or it could be a picture of a busy city street, whatever it might be. We just want something with a bit of detail. Again, they could just be looking out a window. And what you want them to do is to look out the window and name all the objects they can see. So they could call out one at a time. You could get them to put their hands up, or they could do it in their heads, or they could write them down, however feels best aligned with your classroom management strategies. But essentially you want detail. So if they can see a car, great, but what are the details of the car? They can see glass, they can see doors, they can see door handles, they can see plastic, they could see rubber, they could see wheels, they could see antennas. We want detail. We want them looking at that detail. And once they've picked apart all the detail of all the things that they could see out the window or in the picture, we then go to colour. And we want like a specific colour. Blue isn't just blue. You've got like baby blue, you've got navy, you've got aquamarine. Like, get detailed with the colours that you can see. And this draws on those same principles of, giving them something neutral to think about. When their brain is thinking about something neutral, it will give them time to de-escalate as well, because their brain is not feeding them unhelpful thoughts or feeding them stimulus that's overwhelming and dysregulating. So if I said to you all, you're not allowed to think about pink elephants, what's the first thing that you think about? There's always one, though, that says, I didn't think about pink elephants, but guaranteed you did. The minute that you are told not to think about something, you have to think about the thing in order to not think about it and to understand what it is that you're being told not to think about. So your students are not just able to shut off these unhelpful thoughts. So we help them by giving them something neutral to consider instead. Now, I'd like you all to consider how you might incorporate, these 2-minute regulation breaks into your students' day. Now, I can also see some comments in the chat box. So somebody said providing clear boundaries, which is excellent. Putting up the day's timetable on the board. Yes, we love this. What about PE classes that are outside? Sometimes this can be overwhelming for some students. What would you suggest for regulation within some students? Well, first of all, we'd look at, are they hypo or hyper aroused? So is it they're overwhelmed because there's too much happening? So sometimes we actually need to match that need. So if they're overwhelmed, we probably need to take away some of the sensory input. Or if they're under or hypo aroused, we sometimes need to add input to regulate them. So it depends on what the student is dysregulated about. Is it the sights? Is it the sounds? Are they allowed to put sunglasses on? Can sometimes be really effective. Can they put loop earplugs in to deafen down some of the noise? Can they go for like a quick walk while everybody's getting all the equipment together, which can be quite chaotic, and then they come back when you've got the ordered, structured element of the PE lesson? So it's really figuring out what is the sensory need, and are they hypo or hyper aroused, and then kind of meeting it by either taking stuff away or potentially adding stuff in, if that makes sense. But yeah, also thinking, how could you incorporate some of these ideas? They're 2 minutes. They don't take a lot of time. It is a bit of a change sometimes, but we don't want you doing more. We want you doing less. So these should be things that feel simple, which is why I asked everybody as we're going to sort of think, yeah, these ones connect with me. Because when I share strategies, I'm giving you a toolbox and it's up to you. You can pick which tool is going to be right for the job. So you will find the ones that you go, that sounds easy, or that makes sense, or I like the sound of that one, or that would fit my students, and leave the rest. Or maybe you try it with a different cohort at a different time. But just start to think, what are some small things that I could do that would actually help regulate my class, which would give me more time to focus on other things or to support the students. Now, de-escalation. So this is a really important strategy, so we're going to sort of cover some of the topics that we've mentioned before about, your voice. But essentially, when you see emotions rising, your language should become simpler and slower is generally the rule. You want to have a calm voice. You want a safe distance. You want a neutral posture. posture, you want short sentences. We're talking to this part of the brain. So you might see an escalation happening in real time. So the sooner you can get to this, the better. If we can nip it in the bud, if we've got some strategies that we've put in place, put them in, implement them as soon as you start to see it, because otherwise, once we get to this, this kind of peak and they blow their top, you're less and less likely to be able to engage them and to try and head that off at the past with negotiation or coping strategies. They generally will have a blowout and then we have to put the pieces back together. So when you see an escalation, sometimes it is a little bit too late, and an escalation is definitely not the right time to bring in place an escalation plan. You kind of just have to co-regulate as you go. You can pre-negotiate an escalation plan for next time, but not in that moment. We have to wait until that top's back on before we can engage it. So the don'ts of de-escalation: don't debate. And now is not the time. They will A, likely not hear you, or B, it's potentially going to escalate things further. The temptation is to raise your voice to match theirs, particularly to shout over them, to get them, be quiet. Shouting be quiet at someone is generally not an effective thing. It could actually trigger that fight, flight, and freeze response again. We're not making threats. We are not crowding the student. All of these things are likely to keep them in that traumatized space. It will take longer for them to de-escalate. Even if shouting be quiet doesn't have an immediate result, it's actually going to erode that sense of trust and safety and security with you. And we know that connection builds cooperation. It might be effective in the immediacy, but it's actually not going to be effective long-term in terms of working with that student. It's also good to introduce some helpful phrases. You're safe right now. Let's take a moment. I'm here with you. You can repeat these. You can vary them slightly. But having some helpful phrases that can just roll off your tongue, because you're likely to be escalated yourself. We can also use those senses as well. So I've quite often had one of my clients many years ago renamed it for me. I used to call it a sensory self-care box. And she's like, that's cool. But she said, I actually call it my boom box because it stops me from going boom. And I thought that's really cute. So I pinched it and I asked her permission. So now we call it the boom box. And essentially you're filling this boom box with sensory regulation tools or objects. So think about all the different senses and then consider what could you put in a box that a classroom is safe for students to use to regulate their senses. So it could be, the squishy ball, the plasticine, something that's a bit firm that they need to really squish, or they could take some anger out on and, squeeze it and pinch it and, squeeze it like that. Press it, forgetting my words. Could it be something that they can look at? So, bit of a fun fact, our brain likes patterns. It makes us feel safe and regulated. So if you've ever seen in doctors' offices, you quite often have pictures of seashells, or they're certain plants where they've got this sort of swirling shape. It's called a natural fractal. You can Google it if you like, but it's nature based on the Fibonacci sequence, which is, adding, a number each time, and it's patterns in nature. And your brain actually becomes calmer and more regulated simply from looking at these pictures. Very cool. That's why they put it in doctors' and dentists' office and things like that, to trick your brain into feeling calm. So you could have some pictures like that. It could be a seek and find picture. It could be, of something calming and relaxing, like a picture of the ocean. But filling the box with sensory regulation and allowing students to use that, or maybe there's a pre-approved plan where they can come and utilize some of those items. So let's do a quick case review. So I'm going to share sort of a case example, and then I'm going to share those and reiterate those 3 R's of what we might be able to do in a real life example of the the 3 R's, the Bruce Perry's 3 R's. So here's a case example. One of your students, Ava, has recently disclosed that there is family and domestic violence at home. So to be reassured, the situation is currently going through child protection. You're not needing to consider, do I need to report, mandatory reporting? That's all been handled. So we don't need to think about that element of this situation. So rest assured. But what it means is that there's now quite a bit of disruption to her living arrangements, alongside natural experiences of stress and anxiety and the trauma of witnessing violence in the home. So today, during her work, she suddenly slams her book shut, she swears loudly, and she kicks her chair. Her breathing is fast. You can see she's really worked up. Her face is red, and she's sort of kicked the chair and she's walked, and she's now pacing near one of the back walls in your classroom. So the 3 R's. Step 1, we regulate. So this is ensuring safety and calming the nervous system. So as a teacher, you might move slowly, stop at a safe distance of 2 to 3 meters. Your hands are relaxed. Your voice is quiet and even. Ava, I can see that your body is overloaded right now, but you're safe. I'm here with you. So trauma histories often mean that the student's threat response can activate very quickly. So you would avoid approaching too fast, blocking Ava's exit, ordering compliance. Ava, sit down now. You must sit down in the classroom. Come on, everybody, you're disrupting everybody else. It's not going to work. Using public correction is just going to erode your sense of trust, and it's probably going to escalate, or those who are looking for control are probably going to result in defiance and some other challenging behaviours. Instead, you might say, I'm going to give you some space. You don't need to talk just yet. Just breathe with me for a second. But Ava keeps pacing. She's still agitated. And she's muttering, I just don't care anymore. I can hear that. Your body is telling you that it's too much. Let's just slow things down. Your goal is not to stop the behavior instantly. It's very unlikely that saying just one of those things that I've said, you're safe, or one breath is going to do it. It's not. Your goal is not to stop that behavior instantly. It's to slow that escalation. And it's to lower the environmental threat cues. So her brain is no longer seeing all of these things as threat. You're not too close, you're not crowding, you're not threatening. Your voice doesn't sound threatening either in its tone or in the content. Now we move on to relate. This is rebuilding connection once she has begun to calm down. Now, in that first stage, you might also just hand her a squishy ball. Maybe or you've pre-negotiated with her that, here, give this a squeeze, or you could sit there and co-regulate. I squeeze this when I feel angry, then you might offer it. But let's just say that she's started to now just slightly come down. You can, the pacing has slowed. She's still upset, but she's not explosive. Thank you for taking that moment, Ava. Something hit really hard right now, yeah? Ava shrugs and she looks away. But you remain gentle and steady. I know there's so much going on right now. Anyone in your situation would feel overwhelmed. If you notice there's no interrogation, we're not making assumptions, we're validating without prying, but we're sharing signals of safety and attunement. And this is what a trauma-impacted brain needs before we can talk to the reasoning part. Once she's started to settle down and she's making eye contact again and she's stopped pacing, you can see that her face is less red, her breathing has calmed. Only then, once she's stable enough, you see her shoulders drop. You almost see that visible sigh of relief. The escalation is starting to come down. Okay, now that things are a little bit calmer, let's figure out the next step that feels doable. You don't have to go back to work straight away. Here's a couple of options. These might be pre-negotiated options that you've discussed with her or her parents, but if you don't have anything pre-planned, it could be, would you like a short break in, the calm corner? Or do you want to walk with me to, you'll generally have like a wellbeing space, a nurse's office, a deputy principal, or somebody, that you can walk to, or potentially you can call and have someone come to the classroom so you can escort her, or vice versa. She could stay there quietly while the class continues, and she could do some breathing or use some of, the sensory objects that you've got. You could do a quick grounding activity with her, but asking and giving her choice, because remember, that's part of that sense of safety, So which one do you think would feel the best fit right now? So we don't offer too many options as well. Otherwise, analysis paralysis, there'll be too much input. Maybe offer a couple of options that you think would work for her if you know her well. So then, Ava might say the reflection space. That's a really good choice. In a few minutes, I'll come in and check on you, and we'll talk about, what we might do with this if you ever feel like this again. So why and how is this scenario trauma informed? So this is a situation where safety is prioritized over control. So you're keeping your distance, you're reducing those environmental threats, you're not escalating things with commands. You're interpreting the behavior through a trauma-informed lens. So we're seeing not just the top of the iceberg, those behaviors, we're seeing what might be underneath. So instead of defiance, you might see a survival response, which is being triggered by an emotionally charged message. You start to co-regulate, which precedes problem solving. So you understand that a calm voice, steady presence is going to shift that nervous system into a more regulated space. It's also trauma-informed because choice is central. When she can re-engage, you are offering choice, which gives her and restores her sense of agency. And that's really crucial for students with histories of having their control taken away. Ava can't control that there's violence at home, that her mum or her dad are being hurt. But in this moment in the classroom, she can control which wellbeing activity she would like to utilize. And then your follow-up focuses on future learning and support, problem solving together, that collaboration, not punishment. Ultimately, if there was damage to the chair, or, maybe she shouted and swore at another student rather than just randomly swearing, there might need to be reparation, but you would focus on reparation rather than punishment, because you want to build trust and strengthen that future regulation. So next up is knowing when to refer. So you're like, yeah, all of this sounds great, but what if I've got a student that's a little bit more regulated than Ava, who you just described, Rachel? Well, we need to understand when we need to loop in other support professionals. So you are a key observer. You will be able to share really important information that you have observed and picked up while witnessing this student in the classroom, but you're not a diagnostician or a therapist. You might have an inkling that maybe there's some trauma. Potentially this is a student who has full-blown PTSD, but you just need to know the signs and signals for when to refer, rather than feeling that accountability to fix it or solve it. So when to refer. So a really big red flag is self-harm. So is the student engaging in self-injurious behavior? So these are behaviors that are meant to injure or hurt themselves. Now, self-harm can occur for a number of reasons. Please try and keep in your mind that it's a form of communication. Quite often I hear, which is really devaluing of students' experiences, that they were doing it for attention. But even if a student is self-harming for attention, what they're actually trying to communicate is, I need help, I need support, something is wrong. Even if you have an inkling that it's for attention, which I don't even like to go there, but if you feel that it's performative, or, there is still something underlying why they would feel they need to do that in order to elicit connection or attention or comfort. There's something still in there that needs to be supported. But when you see self-harm, it's either to numb or to feel. So maybe they're having too many feelings. The feelings are so intense that a physical release or a physical sensation is easier to cope with and manage than their emotional distress. Or potentially, so that's generally hyper-aroused. Hypo-aroused is lack of feeling. Maybe they feel nothing and it's a sense of relief to feel something. But generally self-harm is one of our biggest red flags that we would say, yep, it's time to refer. We need to involve some other people, need to talk to the parents. We need to get professional referrals in place. If they're describing ongoing intrusive memories, thoughts, or nightmares, referring on. If you notice significant dissociation, so dissociation is not just blanking out, they're dissociating. So they are no longer in this present moment. They are stuck in a distressing or overwhelming thought or memory. So they lose connection with this present moment. So they can you might see them triggered and then go blank. You might not be able to engage with them and communicate. They may be quite frozen. This is quite serious ends of the spectrum. You might also see a major regression in their abilities or behaviours. So you might see the return of soiling or wetting. They might be struggling with concepts that they had previously learnt. Now, it's not only knowing when to refer, but who to refer to. So I'll ask this reflective question as well. Do you know in your school or in your community where or who to refer to? And if you don't, I do have some resources that I've shared, but it's really important to have a catalogue or idea of different resources and services that are available in your particular community. They're quite easy to find. In Australia, we've got a really fantastic website called Ask Izzy, IZZY, ask as in ASK, so askizzy.com.au, and you can plug in all sorts of different services and different presentations or different needs, different areas, and you can find really great lists of services. It's incredibly comprehensive. It's used by lots of the really large organisations, to be able to find services. So people often don't have this, magical compendium in their heads of services. It's being able to use search terms or existing catalogues and finding out what is available. You might also, think about who you would need to collaborate with in order to support this young person. So number one is family or caregivers. Depending on what's happened to them, there may be temporary caregivers in place, or their caregiver could technically be the Department of Child Protection or Protective Services. You would also think about what's available within the school. Do you have a school counsellor, a psychologist, a chaplain, a wellbeing team? It could even be engaging, the executive leadership team, so principals, associate principals, to try and loop them in for support and for escalation. So you do not need to carry these concerns alone. It's really important to share your concerns and to refer out when you hit that limit of, okay, I've tried all these strategies and they're effective to a point, or you see some of those symptoms that I mentioned earlier that are real red flags. You don't need to carry this alone. And I think that kind of brings us to yourselves as educators. So looking after yourself. Now, I've worked with educators for a very long time, and a lot of them are like, I'm too busy. I don't have time to look after myself in the classroom. However, teachers are incredibly prone to experiencing burnout and secondary traumatic stress. These two things are incredibly common in helping professions. So secondary trauma is the emotional and physiological stress response that occurs when somebody is exposed to another person's trauma, especially if it happens repeatedly. This is through hearing their stories, witnessing their distress, or supporting them through a crisis. It's not caused by your own direct traumatic event, but by absorbing the intensity of someone else's experience. And burnout is getting to the point of extreme stress and overwhelm that it affects your functioning and your ability to work and look after yourself. Now, why are these so common in helping professions? Well, because there is some quirk of your personality and mine, because I'm also in a helping profession, that finds a sense of self-esteem or sense of purpose from looking after, growing, develop, or helping people in some way. And that is a wonderful thing, and that can drive us, and that can make us incredibly skilled educators and, teachers. But on the flip side is if your sense of self is tied to feeling helpful or helping or looking after other people, then when you have experiences like this where somebody is so dysregulated, so distressed, so overwhelmed, and it's hard to work with them, it can be really challenging. And when we feel challenged, it can lead us to feeling low or flat about ourselves, that we're not good enough. How come I can't cope? How come, I haven't been able to help? Why can't I make them listen or sit down or cooperate? And so what happens is, because we feel low and flat about ourselves, our brain goes, I know, I'll work harder. I'll push a little bit harder. I'll try a little bit better. And so we expel a little bit more energy. And unfortunately, expelling a little bit more energy only works for a little bit of time, because our emotional pot, it's not everlasting. We have an emotional pot, and we have a certain amount of energy that we can expend to our emotions. Once it's empty, you can't draw from an empty well, and so it costs you a lot to keep being energized, to keep coming back, to keep putting in efforts and supports. So we can end up in this sort of cycle of burnout or secondary stress because we're trying harder. It's not working. We're feeling more exhausted. It's harder to bring that energy. So it's harder to do the work that we want to do. We then second guess ourselves. We feel low and flat about our sense of worth. And so we try even harder until we've fully burnt out. Now, I say this not to frighten anybody, but simply because it highlights that in this role, it's not if you'll experience, a student with trauma, it's when. And we need to really build in self-care and self-regulation into our daily practice as a preparation, as preventative, rather than, oh my gosh, I'm burnt out, I better try and fix it. Or, oh my gosh, I'm now experiencing secondary traumatic stress, I better try and fix it. We try to do things in a preventative way. Looking after yourself is not indulgence, it's professional sustainability. If you do not look after yourself, you will not be able to sustain yourself in this profession. So what are some of the, key things that, we might want to consider? So peer debriefing, find a safe peer that you can debrief with, being mindful of confidentiality and exactly how much you can share. Having clear work-life boundaries. I know that's easier said than done because of some of the requirements, but it could be about, on the drive home, once I hit this certain point in my journey, I'm not allowed to think about work anymore. I'm focused on family life. It could be making sure that if you do have to do work, at home, is that maybe it's done in a specific space and then you shut it all away, put it in a drawer, hide it so that it almost compartmentalizes and you can really switch off from your work. It could be engaging supervision. So finding a mentor, someone who's been in the profession or has worked in, similar cohorts of students. Taking micro breaks, so having your desk set up or your workspace set up to be able to take micro moments. You're not going to be able to say, hey, students, just chill for 10 minutes while I go and do this quick yoga movement or whatever it might be. I'm just going to go for a quick jog around the oval. I'll be back. So we have to take those micro moments. It's about movements and making sure you're getting up from your desk, stretching, engaging mindfulness. You could use some of those grounding activities that I shared, but you can also co-regulate. So what I mean by that is, you could do some preventative stuff in the classroom too that could also benefit you. So if you build in a movement break for your students, move along with them. That will benefit you. That will help break up your day. That will help shift some of, your own stagnant emotions, or just, get your body moving, shift things about. Maybe you could do, a quick check-in at the beginning of the classroom and check in with yourself. Maybe while the students are working, you could, just look out the window and name the things that you can see. It's about working smarter, not harder. I know that there are no extra minutes in your day. So it might be just, how can I, look after the students and simultaneously get some of my own benefits from this. What I really want you to take away is these two self-reflections. What is your one sign, or maybe you have more, that you are running on empty? You need your own cues and to be really, really clued into what it looks like when your wheels are falling off, when you need support, when you need to implement some self-care. We also have self-care that happens on the weekends, and I think everybody fully understands, what self-care looks like. So I won't sort of touch on that too much, but I will sort of touch on the point that self-care is not always massages and getting your nails done or, whatever it might be. Self-care can often be about boundary setting. Actually, I've had a really rough week and I'm not doing anything this weekend, or it could be, actually, I need to socialize. I need to get out of the house and pushing yourself. It could be saying no thank you. So thinking about self-care outside of the typical, way that we think about self-care. But more importantly, what is your sign that you're starting to run on empty? So that you can notice those behaviors creeping in, so that you can sort of reinforce, right, I need to look after myself. I need to engage some more proactive self-care. Because caring for yourself improves your capacity to care for your students and be present. You're more likely to be able to hold that traumatized, distressed student in a safe place. If you're not dysregulated, it will help them to regulate much quicker. And also thinking about who is your support network at school. So thinking about, well, who could I engage with? Do I have a mentor? Could I find a mentor? Sorry, everyone. Is there somebody in the school that I really connect with or I look up to that I could speak to if I needed any additional help? So now just sort of bringing it together before we do our Q&A. So essentially, we're looking at understanding trauma. We now have a better understanding of trauma and how it affects students, those top of the iceberg behaviors that we might see, but also starting to look and explain what's going on underneath. Then we also have the understanding of the brain and the 3 R's. So how do we actually, regulate, relate, and then we start to work on that, repair kind of stage and pre-planning. So I'd like you to think about the model as notice, nurture, and network. So notice and tuning into the changes and cues of the children that you're working with. Nurturing, creating a sense of safety, connection, and regulation. And then networking, how can you collaborate with others, whether it's other professionals, whether it's the family, for support, because you're not in this alone. So I'd invite one final reflection, thinking about all the things that we've learned and covered today. What is one tangible, practical action that you are going to take from today to make your classroom feel safer? You can share it here, or you can take that as a self-reflection away from here. But I just wanted to thank everybody so much for your time and for engaging in this webinar. Hopefully you've learned something from it. So now I will open up to some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was so much practical information there to apply in the classroom.
Thank you.
I think some teachers will have to watch these a few times, take notes. Remember that the slides are available via the event portal if you want to get a copy of those. We've got about 20 minutes for questions now. If you're online with us, submit your questions via the Q&A tab, and we'll try to cover as many as possible. Which what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut down your slides so we can have more of you and less of me.
Also, apologies everyone for all the coughing. I tried my best.
We'll forgive you one day. One day we'll forgive you. All right, so I'm going to start with some questions that we already have prepared here. And if you do have questions, don't forget to ask them away. So first question is, if a teacher could only change one thing tomorrow to make their classroom more trauma-informed, what would your move be? The one big thing that's going to make the most impact? Or if you can't narrow down to one or two things.
Tricky. I would probably say opportunities for regulation, because that's the key before you can do any of the other work. If you don't have a regulated child, all the other things are not possible. So working smart around, is your classroom set up to be able to help students regulate? You know, if you think about the hypo and hyper arousal, have they got opportunities to either have some sensory input or to take some of that sensory input away to help them regulate, and also implementing some of those really, really simple regulation techniques of mirroring emotion, using your posture, your gestures, your tone to sort of co-regulate. If you can get some of that core regulation in, then the other stuff becomes much, much easier.
On that topic, you've talked a lot about various different co-regulation and regulation strategies and techniques specifically. When it comes to building a culture where it normalizes regulation, both at the classroom level, where students think it's a normal thing and it's a cool thing, but also at overall school level where leadership is driving that language and that culture. What are some of the things that you've seen work quite well in schools? Because one thing is to say, let's all sit down and breathe. Another thing is to actually get everybody on board to actually think of that just as getting lunch, something we just do every day. It's part of our thing. And also something that maybe it's even cool and to be celebrated and everybody's looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the culture, you need to find some evidence, right? Nobody's going to buy into it unless they see value in it. So if we're talking about that cultural thing, is we sometimes need to say, little Johnny, has been dysregulated, this and that. We tried this activity and it really helped. He went from A, B, and C behaviors, and now we're seeing, X, Y, and Z. He's much more regulated. If you can give examples of how you've done it and how you've implemented it and the impact, it's going to have far much more value and people are going to buy into it, because that's what you're trying to do, is get people to buy into, is this worth my time? Is this worth the effort to be able to do this? And for students, it's you kind of have to fake it a little bit till you make it sometimes, because some of those things, I guarantee you, as when I first sort of did play therapy and, working with kids, sometimes it felt so fake and false to say, I know you look so sad right now. And when you say that to, parents or teachers, they kind of look at you like, that sounds very cringe. That sounds very awkward. And so you kind of have to just, put a bit of acting into it, put a little bit of, I'll just do it and I'll see it and I'll try it and I'll give it a go. So it's about not feeling like a goose, not feeling silly. You're talking to a dysregulated student, give it a go, give it a try, see what works for you, what feels effective, what's good for your students. And that's where you'll find that happy medium of it's something fun and engaging. It's knowing who your kids are, knowing what you like, so you can sell it. If you can sell it and you can be enthusiastic, well, they'll come on board. But if you're cringing and going, oh, this lady on the internet told me that I should give this a try, and you don't believe in it, they're not gonna buy into it either. So it's got to be stuff that you feel could be effective and that you believe in.
Have you ever come across a school that has some sort of peer program where, regulation support is driven by peers? Because, think about you're in a schoolyard and, someone trips over and you might have a kid that, help you up. That's just what you do. But if someone is having a meltdown, people are less likely to do that. Usually they just walk away, especially young kids, or they will kind of fall into it. Have you ever seen a school actually have a program that has become so normalized that the other kids are jumping in and helping their friends regulate?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that on an individual level, and I'll explain that, but I'll also explain sort of the school level stuff as well. Is sometimes it can help to have a champion, or giving somebody, maybe it rotates so that people don't feel sort of left out. Maybe it's their job. We don't want to make them feel responsible for meltdowns or get involved in unsafe situations, because we know when someone's dysregulated, they could be violent or could hurt emotionally or physically if they're that dysregulated. But it could be, things that have worked is almost having like a buddy system, or, having a wellbeing champion. Maybe kids love being able to choose and be in charge. So I've seen it work really well where there's the students in charge gets to pick the grounding activity. I've got like a big pack of like different breathing cards, and they're all sorts of fun activities because kids love variety. And so it could be, bubble breathing. So, and blowing some bubbles in the classroom and doing a breathing activity, or maybe it's, lion breathing or snake breathing, and, the kid gets to choose and then runs the classroom through it. They love that sense of ownership. They feel a sense of pride, and it gets everybody taking accountability and ownership of well-being. But on a personal level, I love seeing the moment where the things that you've been hammering home to these kids sinks in. So one of the things I like to do in play therapy is play games, because you can get a really good gauge of where a young person's at with how they engage in the games. Do they cheat to sort of build their self-esteem? How do they manage when they're losing? How do they react? How do they respond? And so, I like playing games for that reason, because it's a good assessment tool. But when you've been hammering home, it's great to sort of breathe and relax, or to use this strategy or that strategy. Quite often I've simulated in play therapy me losing a game and pretending to have, getting worked up. I don't become dysregulated. That's unsafe. But it's so lovely because you see the kids, what you realize that they've taken it in, it's that, implicit or implied learning. And they're like, oh, you're getting overwhelmed. Have you tried to do some calm breathing? Or how about we crumple up some paper together? Or, you can stamp your feet over in the stamping corner, or whatever it might be. And they're taking it all in, they're learning, you're teaching them with that implication and practice over time. And it does sink in whether you feel like it is or not. So if you're implementing that and you're giving them the tools, that means they've got it in their tool chest when they come up against a problem, they see a peer struggling, or, they're trying to help out a friend, you'll see some of that kick in because they've been practicing it over and over.
Thank you. Question from Colleen here. My teaching area is science. How do we set up an area for regulation in a laboratory? Away from the explosives.
Yes. Some classroom settings are a little bit trickier. So I guess it would depend on the age of the students and the setup of the school. It could be something just outside, or it could be a corner, maybe near your desk, maybe where there's nothing, happening. But you could set up like a box or a place where they could engage, within the classroom. If they're old enough and mature enough, and also they're not engaged in the fight and flight stage where they might just leave the classroom and flee, it might be something set up just outside of the classroom. If you've got like a central, sometimes there's like a central hub where you've got the classes, or you can give them permission to take the box and go and sit on the bench just outside of the classroom, pick something, use it, take some deep breaths. So it could be, put on the noise cancelling headphones to sort of block out the noise of the lab around, or it could be, have a look through these breathing activities and work through one, have a look at some of the pictures or do some of the grounding. So you can kind of create a space by having that that box, or by creating a sensory kind of almost like curtains or blocks or something. You can use their senses to help create that space, even in a really busy classroom.
A bit of a futuristic question. Do you see wearables and AI becoming a part of this setup in terms of regulation in school? I'll give you a practical example that I just thought of. Let's say, students have their little wristbands and it's measuring their heart rate. And then it notices that, and they've got a little earphone as well that they just wear around at school. And then it notices that their heart rate has gone up quite a lot and they seem to be quite stressed. Then the little voice comes into their ear and said, hey, Rachel, I noticed you seem to be hyped up. Are you okay? And then just talks through it. Let's do a quick breathing exercise with me.
Yeah.
And you actually don't have any disruption, but you have that real-time interaction. And eventually at the end of like a week period or a day, you've got reports on, how these kids fared throughout the day and how they had moments of potential stress, if the techniques were implemented, whether they worked or didn't work in terms of regulation and so on. Obviously, it's a bit creepy to be monitored all the time, but it could be for very specific application, just really looking at just emotion regulation and things like that. Do you see that being a practical thing, or do you see that being a bit of an overreach and a bit too much?
Look, I think that we haven't even tapped into the potential powers of AI. There's a lot of concerns around AI replacing human conversation and AI in the risk space, because there's nothing can replace human-to-human connection. But there's some really interesting things happening out there in this space that we probably don't even know or haven't even thought about just yet. I know that there's been some, like on a personal level, and I'm not saying go off and do this, but I know that some people have been training AI agents with knowledge and context about certain problems so that it can respond in really intuitive ways with all of that context, and it's trained to respond in a certain pattern or with certain, sort of like you were saying, I've noticed that, your breathing patterns or your heart rate has increased. But if you're building these AI agents, you can actually, feed in, what technique works for, this student at that time based on this context. So, I mean, the potentials are amazing and terrifying at the same time. I know that some of my clients are like, between sessions, adult clients, I've gone off and I've, put in some journal prompts into ChatGPT, or I'm, I've pulled out this and I've used it, to give me some ideas, in between sessions. But I think there's so many opportunities and potentials that we've just not even thought about. The mind boggles.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could complement teachers. Obviously, you're going to have the face-to-face and everything, but if you had some add-ons that are helping, provide more personalized support to students that doesn't require the teacher to go one-on-one to a class of 20, 25 people every single time something happens, then it would probably be useful.
Yeah, there's some research that I know is trying to get off the ground around the prediction tools of AI and sort of feeding assessment results, not sort of like education testing, but sort of psychological testing and psychological sessions, and feeding that into AI to help it create predictors so that we can actually see when sort of like escalations are building or more likely, to help us predict those a bit better, to be able to respond more proactively, which I think is a bit futuristic and a little bit cool, and definitely not here yet, but very interesting about what could potentially come up.
Thank you, Rachel. This question is from Casey. What would you suggest for when students that we may not have a pre-existing relationship with or knowledge of come on camp? Many camp leaders are not trained in this area, and teachers are out of their comfort zones, and they need to also manage students who are sensory overload and away from home.
Yeah. So I think that can be a little bit difficult because you don't know what works well for them and what doesn't. I guess if you can co-regulate first to be able to get enough like enough calm down that you can then ask them the questions. So it could be, what sounds better for you? What works better? What have you tried in the past that's been effective? So we're just trying to use like some of those core skills that will be sort of fairly universal, of like calm breathing, taking them away from the trigger, or from prying eyes, especially in a camp setting where there might be lots of other students around. Can you use that proximity? Can you use your voice and your tone? All of those things are fairly universal, and you don't need to know them, as a unique human and their lived experience. But as you start to sort of move into that relate, and you're naming emotions, you could be asking, is that right? Maybe you don't know them that well. It sounds like, you're feeling really angry. Does that sound right? Is it something else? And getting them to sort of give you feedback. And then when you get into repair and sort of trying to fix it and solve, is asking them lots of questions. Has this ever happened before? I've got a couple of ideas. What one do you think sounds the least cringe, or which one do you think sounds like it might work better for you? Or do you find that moving your body helps, or do you need quiet? And then you can also just sort of a bit of trial and error about the hyper and hypo arousal. Can I take things away? Do I think that's going to help regulate them? Usually that's probably a better rule of thumb, is they tend to be hyper aroused, and that's when you see like a big blow up. Hypo aroused is they sort of freeze or withdraw into themselves. So you're more likely to just, the rule of thumb will probably be, and it's quite universal, it doesn't have to be, unique to that student, is can I take away some of the sensory input, some of the noise, some of the visuals, some of the, the intensity of the situation? Can we sort of like move it away? And those rules of thumb should get you through enough without having to sort of know the students innately to then be able to build in some of those other coping strategies that might then be more tailored to them.
Thank you, Rachel. In the first 48 hours after a crisis, what are the most helpful micro-interventions teachers can use without risking doing too much or too little?
Yeah, so I guess it's important to refer on if they haven't already, because you would want the right professional supports in place, and for somebody else to be aware that a traumatic event has occurred, because you don't need to be responsible for that person coming out of that traumatic event, but you can absolutely support by not hindering. So when we talk about, those first sort of 48 hours, that validation, that empathy is absolutely massive. It could be about pre-planning. So going, hey, some stuff has happened. Instead of waiting for the, for things to kick off or to escalate, it could be about pre-planning, thinking about that collaboration with key people in that student's life, parents, like what has happened, what supports have you got in place? Has anything been sort of effective, knowing what they're doing at home so you can replicate or repeat, giving them opportunities and kind of pre-planning for, if you need to leave, what are the supports within the school? Who can we escalate to? Like if you need to run out of the classroom, how can you do it safely? Who can you go to? Where's a safe space that you can do that? If you need to move your body, like how can we do that with minimal disruption? So do you need to pre-plan in some of these things preemptively, but also giving them that permission and that choice where you can, so that you're not sort of having to try and speak to that dysregulated brain. You're actually pre-planning and pre-deciding what might work best. And just by involving the student and their family in that, you're meeting some of those control and collaboration kind of trauma-informed principles. So it's sort of do no harm rather than you need to do anything actively, is just sort of do no harm, prepare, get things set up just in case, and then validate, normalize, and work on that connection. It will be the only things that you really would need to do.
Thank you, Rachel. One final question before we wrap it up. If teachers want to build long-term trauma-informed capacity in their school, what's the single habit, system, or cultural shift they should champion first?
Definitely that SAMHSA, those principles. It forms almost like a checklist for schools and teachers to be not only that classroom level, but school wide. So there's that slide on it, which has the 6 principles to sort of run through. And it's sort of like creating a little check. You can use AI if you want, have a look, depending on if you've got, I think depending on where you work, is whether you're allowed to use AI or it's built into your systems and what it's allowed to access. But you could sort of build in, what's a checklist for ensuring that I've met all these safety things, or, we currently do this, what could we be doing better? So trying to sort of build up that compendium of, well, how do we see and respond to trauma as a school? Because it's not if, it's when these things are going to happen to students. And so it's just that pre-planning, preemptive, seeing what's missing, so that analysis, that gap analysis of, what might we, be lacking a little bit, or what could we be doing better, and sort of building up some really practical strategies to then, be able to put that in place.
Wonderful stuff, Rachel. Thank you so much. It's been a great session, and this wraps up our 2025 series of 10 masterclasses for teachers. Any final words, recommendations to do next that you'd like to share with anybody watching this session?
Just being really kind to yourselves. A lot of people come into these kinds of topics thinking, well, what can I do to fix trauma or to make this better? Just being really kind to yourself. And, some of those changes feel really simple. People often say to me, that sounds too simple to be effective, but just give them a try. Find out what works for you, what works for your classroom, your cohort of students. Trial and error. Some things will feel really simple and some things will feel really clunky. So it's just giving it a try, and just thinking about those principles of the simplicity of regulating and relating, and then you can, do some of the work to repair or to problem solve and to try and reduce some of those behaviours ongoing. But it's take that pressure off yourself would be my biggest recommendation.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you, everybody else. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.